The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
What chapter were we reading this week?
Unspecified, but either chapter 8 or 9.
Oh,
People here have started chapter 9. Okay, so a couple people, but I guess.
that means it must be near the end of the term because there's only 9 chapters. Well, any reactions? Some of us were just at this all-day meeting of the Media Lab faculty and sponsors, and I think the last scene was Hugh Hare, wasn't it? Who is a professor who lost both his legs in an mountain climbing accident some years ago, and he's specialized in building artificial legs. And he ended his talk by climbing up a climbing wall that he had conveniently installed in Kresge and disappeared into the roof. How many of you have done climbing? Technical rock climbing? None of you. I once did it for a while, and then one day I found I wasn't scared and quit forever. Because if you're not scared, there's no point. So I don't know why do people do it in the first place? Who has a theory of why people do those strange things? We haven't planted enough questions. But our audio engineer did it. Why did you do it? What got you into rock climbing?
What got me into rock climbing? I had some close friends that do a lot of rock climbing and extreme sports.
Do they all survive?
They've all survived, and we've all fallen, but never hit the ground.
You were on a rope.
Yeah, definitely on the road. They like to do a lot of mountaineering. And I'm a young rock climber for like 4 years. I got hit by the plug. Like a drill.
For me, it was a very strange thing. Your perception of the world changes when you're an active rock climber because you see a room in a different, I was going to say perspective or representation, but I remember the first thing when I came into a room was, can I get all the way around this room without touching the floor? And the answer is, I certainly can get that far because there's plenty of room on the blackboard and everything is trivial up to there. But the real technical climbers see things you can't see, and if there's a faint discoloration of the rock, then they know, well, I can probably get the edge of my shoe into that. And so it's an interesting perspective because every room poses a new problem that normally you would never think of. I suppose you could think of the floor as very hot or something, but I don't remember doing that. So how many different ways do you have to... Who can think of 8 ways to think of a room? How long should we wait? Yes.
I think part of rock climbing is a part of a physical challenge and as a change of perspective also. What we talked about a couple of weeks ago, not only what you're thinking of and how you're perceiving the room, but also what you're not thinking of. Because when you're on a mountain, you should not think that you should not worry about what you will have for dinner tomorrow night, or you're very, very focused. And I think that that's also the pleasure of sports or any activity where you have the time to just focus on one thing, nothing else.
That's a great idea. Special situation where you don't have to worry about what to think about because you know more or less exactly what the problem is at every moment. So you're both thinking and not thinking, and you don't have to think about what to think about.
When you have a problem to solve.
Usually you have a very clear geometric problem of there are 5 things you could hold on to, and each of them has... That's interesting. I wonder how far you... Is it like chess, where you look ahead 3 steps at each? And you also have a general plan. Do football players have plans? Or is it just the next play? Yeah.
I would argue that we have some sort of physical muscle memory type way to think. For example, when you look at a rock climbing route, at least when I do, you envision exactly how you're going to have to feel to lurch to the next post. You can feel exactly what your body's going to be tensed, how it's feeling. So I would argue that it's a physical way to think as to understand what your body does.
Yes, that's certainly true. It's interesting how many people actually think that it is muscle memory, but as far as I know, muscles don't remember anything. So it's, I remember somebody talking about some pianist's hands, and as far as I could see, there was absolutely nothing unusual about this pianist's hands, but it's part of the humanist tradition to think that the body learns, and I wonder if that's a good image. It's because we know that most of that stuff occurs in the cerebellum. There's a little bit of learning in the spinal cord. And I don't know if anybody's ever... Does anyone know if you can learn new spinal reflexes? Yeah.
Just a comment, if I may. The last answer to your question is one that's very much involves kinesthetic appreciation of the situation that you're in. That brings to mind the Galton phenomenon, his categorization of the 3 different ways that people have a primary mode of thinking about things, being verbal, visual, and kinesthetic.
Whose classification?
This was Galton.
Francis Galton.
Yeah, that Galton. For instance, I know someone very close to me who would, if she were thinking about mountain climbing at all, it would be in terms of the great stories she would have to tell in the future, having once survived this dangerous challenge.
Yes, right. You can probably afford some slow, high-level thoughts about the activity, but But they better not get in the way of what you're gonna, where you're gonna get your next handhold. This tradition of thinking that the body has a memory is very pervasive. It was a serious problem for William James, who was maybe the first great cognitive psychologist, and he was convinced that emotional thinking, if you want to call it that, was primarily concerned with the body. But as we heard a brief lecture this morning by someone whose name I won't mention, who discussed various phenomena about what happens when you actually lose a limb, and some people can still visualize somebody who has lost an arm can still imagine just how they would use that arm to perform an operation of some sort. And clearly now that's happening in the brain. And you could call it kinesthetic memory, but actually a lot of it is, or all of it perhaps, is being simulated by a simulator that you've built in earlier years and still have it.
Suppose you need memories away from your hands so that other parts of the body can predict what kind of actions would lead. So if you are fine, if you want to think that your hand is not going to reach a place, then can you move your body even forward?
Yes, right. Yes, there's I remember one of the first things that got me interested in thinking about higher level thinking was some discussion of how intelligent are chimpanzees. And one criterion was that the chimpanzee can imitate an action. That is, if you pick something up, a typical chimpanzee, if it feels like that, could also do the same thing. Whereas my dog never imitates something I do. And but then you run into the question of what does it mean to imitate? And the chimpanzee is not imitating your action, it seems to me. In order to do this, because suppose I were here, if I imitate that action, I would do this. If you take imitate meaning to reproduce, to record a representation of that action and then perform it, I don't think any chimpanzee would be that dumb. So what the chimpanzee is really doing must be, it must have imagined what your goal was. That is, it isn't saying he did this, it's saying he thought he would pick up that VGA connector, although I doubt if it represents it as a VGA connector. So if you look at the old literature in psychology, or even some today, you don't see a clear recognition that actions, when people talk about embodiment and imitation and learning by copying what someone else is doing, I see very little recognition in most of psychology that what you're doing is guessing or somehow representing what the goal of the action was, and then saying, I'm going to make that a goal for me, and then I have to compute what action I have to do it.
I've noticed you can get dogs to want to eat something
You can.
by pretending to eat it yourself, even if it's not an edible thing. Like if I've done this experiment where you'll take something completely inedible, doesn't have any smell to it, and I'll pretend to eat it and then put it on the ground, and then the dog will try to eat it as well.
I'll have to try that when I get home, but I have a feeling that ZZ isn't that smart. Yes.
A number of years ago, there was an attack on Piaget, who claims that children don't really begin to imitate until they reach some certain point of advanced development. The attack was based upon experiments where a little infant was strapped down in a seat and forced to watch people sticking out their tongues
Yes.
at it. Now, this was at a very early age, and the claim was that Piaget's notions were all shot down because of this very simple experiment. It seemed to me that what was involved there was some attempt to, I guess, maybe comprehend by mirroring the activity or replicating the activity as much as possible that the infant saw another person doing. But I don't know if that would qualify as imitation in the higher level sense that you're...
Yeah, I think that's very important. Bob Lawler has thought about these things a lot. And I also have seen some of these objections, like such as Piaget demonstrates that children don't seem to have a good concept of 3 or 4 until they're actually 3 years old or so. And then some people point to experiments where you can teach a younger child to distinguish between a set of 2 or 3 things. And there's a question of whether this is a valid criticism of Piaget's plan of intellectual development, where he studies a large number of, actually he got most of his ideas in very early years of studying very carefully his own 3 young children and asking them questions and giving them little puzzles. And then later started an institute where a lot of his conjectures about the usual sequence in which children develop new concepts and skills develops. A lot of them were confirmed in these later experiments. And then other people criticized that by showing situations where apparently babies or infants do some of these things much earlier. And somewhere in the emotion machine, I have a discussion of face recognition. I can't remember which chapter it's in, but I read a doctoral thesis by a French PhD student, Francesca Acquera, and she notices various things like that an infant might smile when you smile at it, and you could regard that as imitation. My guess is that, and one of her ideas is that the infant is born with certain built-in instinctive reactions which are later replaced by higher level mechanisms which in very few cases do the same thing. And so my conjecture is that, yes, if you take I think even a 4-month-old infant and go like that, it will open its mouth. I forget whether it's really 3 or 4 months or when. And what Acquera concluded, she observed a rather strange phenomenon, which is that at the age of about 5 months, a child becomes excited when its mother appears. And if you disguise another person as its mother, it gets even more excited if two copies of its mother appear. Whereas at 6 months, it gets really distressed if two mothers appear. And this is part of her general argument that a lot of the machinery of early perception is different from the ones that it's replaced by. And so Piaget is not wrong. I don't recall whether she mentioned Piaget at all in the thesis, but the point is that there are some things that are built into the baby just so it'll survive. See, in chapter 3, I have these long discussion of attachment. And it has various theories of why it's good for a child to become attached to particular people so that it can learn how to decide what to do and what's valuable and what's not, and so forth. And I have a little conjecture that if it got attached to several people, then it might become incompetent because it would get conflicting advice. So it's good to be especially attached to one person just so that you have a good chance of getting a consistent system. Whether it's in the long run good or bad is less important than whether it gives the child a way to progress and survive and keep learning rather than getting filled with inconsistencies and contradictions. But one of her observations was that, yes, the very young infant does respond selectively to its mother in some cases. A standard conjecture is that children first recognize other people by smell, by the way, and then by sound of voice, and only later by vision. But in her thesis, she notes that by disguising the mother in various ways, the main way that the very young infant recognizes his mother is by the hairdo. So if you put a net over the mother's hair, I don't remember the ages exactly, but the 3-month-old baby might not respond to the mother if the infant just sees its face. And I suspect that a lot of previously done experiments didn't control for hairdo. And so that there was a widespread belief that very young infants do recognize the mother. Now, for the built-in reaction that if you smile or open your mouth, when you smile, you show your teeth. Usually your mouth is a bit open. And I've certainly noticed that fairly young babies, and I don't remember the age, will appear to imitate you. But I suspect that this is a very special mechanism which is built in for the dual reason that if the mother doesn't get attached to the baby, then it's bad news for that particular subspecies to survive. And if the baby doesn't respond to the mother at all, well, I bet that the mother is not going to like it much, but it's a great thing if you go and the baby goes. Then you already think of this idiot as a person and worth interacting with and worth giving up your profession and spending the next 6 years taking care of it. So this question of, I don't know of any good experiments that really refute anything that Piaget said, and I'm not a scholar of this. But you did a lot of experiments.
Yeah, well, I think the best way to think about Piaget's theories, and I think this is true of yours as well, I think it's captured in a comment of our colleague Seymour Packard, about Piaget as he approached the end of his career. And a little tribute to him, he said, if perchance it should be the case that this theory of equilibration of Piaget's, that is the balancing of changing in the organism and adapting to the environment, if this theory of equilibration should prove wrong, it would be a tragedy but it would be replaced by another theory, and we would have to believe that the new theory would likewise be a theory of equilibration. The notion is that Piaget so changed psychology's way of looking at learning and the nature of knowledge that it's changed the whole climate of opinion. And similarly, I think that your focus on envisioning computational ways of thinking about thinking has and will continue to change the way other people think about knowledge and think about intelligence.
So all the theories
So
could
if
be
your
wrong.
theory's proven wrong, Marvin, it's going to be replaced by something else that's going to be like another society of mind.
Yeah, that's
Well, we can hope that that will be the case, and bet it will.
That's nice. But still, it looks to me like most of what Piaget looked pretty sound.
Yes, well, some of the stuff like the development of formal operational theories as a natural consequence of experience in everyday life is not so well accepted as it used to be when he was about to defend himself. But in terms of experimental work, he's certainly one of the most creative and one of the most thoroughgoing of psychologists in the last century. And his ideas are in a great, long-standing tradition of system building and thinking about how systems of things work together in concert to develop really complicated outcomes.
Yeah, someday we should make a list. Because if you try to learn cognitive psychology, you don't get much history these days. And if I had a must-reading list, it would have quite a few chapters of Aristotle's Ethics, for example, because he has little AI theories there that are so commonsensical that you don't see them very much. And you certainly ought to read some of William James. These old guys, some of whom are practically out of print. And Piaget wrote too many books, but probably everyone should read a couple of Freud's early books. They're really quite easy to read. He's a great writer. And I don't know what's the most compact, good early Piaget book?
Well,
The Child's Conception of Space?
Well, that's a very good one. But there are a couple that have different virtues. I mean, I once asked Seymour about this. Seymour Papert worked with Piaget for 5 years as his mathematician and was in some sense a kind of heir apparent.
And he also became director of a lot of the experiments.
Yeah. But one of the books that's sort of a classic in its kind is The Child's Conception of Number. A good summary that Piaget wrote with Barbel Inhelden is called The Development of the Child. Mimi Sinclair's favorite book was just called Intelligence by Piaget. Shep White's favorite book was The Origins of Intelligence in Children. He said that, in his judgment, that was where Piaget got deepest into the nature of thought and revealed his theories about the genesis of intelligence. Another great book is Biology and Knowledge, which shows some of the links in the early days between Piaget's theories and those of Warren McCulloch. So there's a lot of great stuff that Piaget wrote. Even though George said he wrote too much.
How many adventure stories and novels the average educated person reads? But people very rarely read textbooks because textbooks are terrible. And they don't have the idea of reading these original sources by those heroes. And in almost every case, reading a bit of William James, who's a very good writer, is easier than reading any textbook that might mention his theories. So it's a sort of paradox. It's easier to read these classics, and usually they're much better than any summary of them you'll see, because the summary is very likely to have been written after another scientific paradigm has replaced the old one, and in my view, is very likely a fad that will pass and missed the whole point of what these early people did. So I think somebody, Sussman made me read, I haven't read it yet. He said, you shouldn't try to understand that quantum mechanics issue we were talking about until you read Dirac's first paper on it. And it had never occurred to me that one could read Dirac's first paper on something. But according to Jerry, and I can't confirm it yet, it's easier to read because he gives all the reasons for why you should do this and that, rather than just summarizing a particular algebraic model without any motivation. So I remember telling people they should read these classics, and they say, well, that will take too long. And
well, that's why I wanted to mention this other favorite little book of Piaget's. It's a little paperback called Genetic Epistemology that was translated from the original French into English by Eleanor Duckworth, who's in the Ed School up at Harvard. It's very well written in the English form, and it's very accessible. It could only take maybe an hour and a half at most to read. And it gives a lot of history and explains, among other things, the impact of group theory on Piaget's thinking. So he ran into one of the Bourbaki mathematicians at a train ride. So that's the accident. But another thing, Piaget wrote a book on time and space, I think, and that was after going to visit Einstein at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He went to ask Einstein what was really important to know about time and space, and how could one communicate that to children, and how could one explore their knowledge. So Piaget's done fascinating work.
well, maybe we should collect these all. It's probably out of copyright by now.
Ah, could very well be, yes.
What's the best paper on psychology to read in the last 20 years?
Oh, goodness.
I'd love to know. If you're interested in AI, you should read, there's 4 or 5 papers by Douglas Lennett, which are very thoughtful and interesting. If you try to understand psych, that's pretty hard, but he's written various essays on the problems that he encountered in trying to develop that project. And for artificial intelligence, that Computers and Thought book, which is quite old, but it contains very clear classics, about a dozen collections of ideas, some of which have gotten forgotten, like, well, I'm not sure what are good examples.
You know, maybe I shouldn't say this to you, but I really loved your frames paper, Framework for Representing Knowledge, just because, again, it reorganized the way I think people thought about some of the issues in artificial intelligence. And, you know, I would consider that a great psychology paper, even though you might be embarrassed to have it go in that category.
No, I still like it. I was looking for the sections I cut out of it, which were, right now I have a great many scribblings that I took out of the emotion machine, and I'm trying to decide which of them are worth putting back in it or making another something.
How many bad ideas do you get?
One doesn't remember them very effectively.
I was wondering that you
I remember being very impressed by the first Newell and Simon paper on the general problem solver, because I had written a big paper that did that sort of thing in a different way, and I couldn't believe that I had not gotten this idea, which was about 3 times simpler than the one I had. And so I always read everything else they read, hoping that I would find something else equally important that I had missed. But, after that, what happened is they made some very beautiful ideas about high-level artificial intelligence, and then suddenly they decided to prove that that's how people worked. And unfortunately, this happened about the time when rule-based systems were becoming popular. And rule-based systems are a way of representing skills in a non-reflective way. So commercially, they're tremendously powerful. Lots of people have made, if the situation is this, do that. If it's this, do that. And for many applications, it's much better than any other kind of programming. Because in a program, what happens depends on the order in which you do the things. In rule-based systems, you're sort of starting over, not completely, because there's a context. And so then they suddenly decided, let's see to what extent we can explain human psychology as collections of rule-based systems. And in my view, they stopped producing new ideas once they tried to prove that that idea was the right one. So
Well, if you were making a recommendation, would you pick the sciences of the artificial as, in a way, the high point of their work, as opposed to human problem solving?
yes, in fact, 2 little
which
books.
has its own virtue.
There's a little book by Herbert Simon, which is just about 100 pages, 100 small pages, on economics. And it's spectacular. And it's a little bit about AI. Is it the same one? I don't think so.
I don't think so, no.
Which is the one about the ant crawling on the beach?
That's the science of the
Okay, that's a little book. And that little book is probably maybe the best introduction to the question of heuristic search and how you could make something solve problems. It's very beautifully done. I was thinking he has another book whose name I forget, which is about 100 pages, small pages, and it's a book on economics. And it starts out, it says, there are these people in a country, and there's only one thing that's manufactured, and they're called bread bricks. And you can either eat a bread brick and survive, so you need a certain number of bread bricks to consume, and you can save bread bricks if you've got a surplus. And the third option is you can build a bread brick factory. So if you get enough bread bricks, you can build a bread brick factory, and it will make a bread brick every day or every hour or something. And that's the whole world. And then he points out that, well, suppose there's a bunch of people and they each have a few bread bricks and they're just sitting there. Well, you could loan them to someone else. Like you have 10 bread bricks. You could loan them to someone else for a fee of 1 bread brick a day. And if it takes 50 bread bricks to make a bread brick factory, then if somebody can talk 10 people into giving him, or say 20, into giving him 5 bread bricks, or 10, then he can build a bread brick factory, and he can also pay them a bread brick a month to pay his debt, and he can start manufacturing it. And if he plays his cards right, he can get very rich if he can talk the others in. You see where I'm getting? There's nothing else in this model But then he's able to deduce all of it, or almost all of economics from this trivial thing. And the great thing about this world, where there's only one object, is that you can write equations for what the interest rate ought to be and blah, blah, blah. And that's a little masterpiece. On the other hand, you could read Samuelson, which costs $100 and is 400 pages, and they're big pages, and try to learn economics. And
Well, Simon did get the Nobel Prize for his work in economics.
yes, he got the Nobel Prize for, and it was an AI idea that, namely, you shouldn't try to optimize, you should just do enough to get by and then do something else with the rest of your resources. I'm not sure what the idea was. But in his autobiography, he also mentions how he got the Nobel Prize. And he decided he wanted the Nobel Prize, and so the first thing he did was to learn Swedish. And so he learned Swedish, and he went to Sweden and became friends with all the academicians. And he was a shoo-in. I bet none of the other economists knew Swedish. I once ran into him and asked him what he was up to, and he says, "Oh, I'm organizing a conference, and the admission requirement is you have to be dean of a graduate school of business administration." And I said, "Why are you doing that?" And he said, "I thought it would be fun. I always wanted to lord it over those deans of graduate schools of business administration." Also, I once asked, we were walking somewhere, and I said, "Isn't it terrible how nobody's paying attention to all these great new ideas in artificial intelligence?" And he said, "No, it's great. We have it all to ourselves. Let's hope they don't catch on for a long time." And I was sort of shocked. But after a while, I realized he was right. It was fun having it all to ourselves for a long time. So if you have something good, don't tell anyone. Well, that's a long digression.
What about writing?
Writing?
Reading? You talked about reading, I'm saying, what about writing?
Oh, I don't know. I was thinking of going to writer's school to learn how to write faster.
People usually go to write better, don't they? I mean, so why are you focused on writing faster?
I asked Gregory Benford, and he said, I asked several writers, and they said, all you have to know is that every day you have to write 1,000 words, and it doesn't matter how good or bad they are.
So it's generating trash?
I once asked Asimov, and I said, how do you write so much? And he said, I just sit at the typewriter all the time and keep typing. So I never got any good advice.
Did he ever read his books? Because he generated so many.
He couldn't have had time.
He said he stopped making second drafts around late 1970s.
Okay. Published like 400, over 400 books.
Well, half of them were anthologies, and so when he counts the books he edited, and editing means he chose the stories. So he, grossly exaggerating, he only wrote 200 books.
Well, a lot of Piaget's works are also anthologies of researches conducted by his students and staff. So his name goes on the collection. And because he was the great poobah of the School of Genetic Epistemology, and he provided the funding for everybody, he also had his name on just about all of the individual articles. But a lot of that was work by other people as well. This was work from the Institute of Genetic Epistemology. But his own work was in some ways glorious.
Yeah. Yes, there was a Professor William Sweet at Mass General Hospital, neurosurgeon, I think he was, and he had published about 1,000 papers. But they were, if you looked at the papers, they were all by him and a bunch of residents or other surgeons on the staff. So I mentioned that to one of the residents and said, how come his name is on that, all those papers? And they said that's actually a tradition in medicine, and there's no way around it because a medical laboratory can't get funds unless it has a hero, a big name. And all the residents agreed that just to keep the thing going, they have to make it look like. And I'm sure Sweet was a good researcher, but I couldn't find any papers only by him. And basically, every time there's an interesting case, they write it up and publish it somewhere. And even that's legitimate because Mass General is or was then, maybe still is, the neurosurgical place of last resort, best place in the US. And every case that gets referred to them is very likely to be, I'm sure they don't publish every case, but each of these published ones probably has some worthwhile, important observation about a particular peculiar condition that other people didn't know how to handle. So we have that kind of, so in some fields, in biology, you have this kind of institutionalized, putting the head professor's name on all the papers. And the researchers don't complain much. I never co-authored a paper at all, except with Papert and McCarthy and a couple of people where we each did a lot of the work. And my policy was never to put my name on a student's paper. And I didn't break that rule until a few years ago when some Japanese student said, if I don't put my name, then no one will believe it was worthwhile because I was in your laboratory, because in all Japanese laboratories, if the head of the department isn't on the paper, it means that it wasn't approved of. It was annoying because this was, I forgot his name, this was a Toshiba research fellow, not really a student, and he wrote a program that actually figured out what was going on in some cartoons, which is a sort of tour de force of some kind of sort of half symbolic vision programming. He did a very nice job, and my recollection was I didn't believe he could do it, and tried to talk him out of it. And I certainly didn't deserve to have my name on his paper. So in some fields, the students write the papers, and others, it's just different because of having that history. Yeah.
Well, this is back to the subject of the book, but in chapter 9, you deal with the subject of what is pleasure and why do we like it, which I think is very interesting because I don't know anywhere else where that topic is really addressed, other than treating it as some sort of phenomenon.
Yes, there's a point, I forget whether I mentioned it there. I once wrote an essay that I never did publish, but the idea is that suppose you do something and it's successful, and you get a reward, or you reward yourself and you feel very good about this. I had this funny conjecture that the function of pleasure is that there's a complicated process of credit assignment. In other words, I've had a success. What should I learn from it? And what you have to do is remember very clearly the various things you did, including the wrong ones. And you have to decide which were the right ones, and you have to learn not to do the wrong ones as well as, I mean, the standard theory in psychology was that when an animal does something, it just rewards the last thing it did. It's called recency. And in behaviorism, there was no sophisticated concept of learning at all except this recency thing. So my conjecture was, suppose you've solved this problem and there's various things that happened hidden in your various short-term memories. Then in order to do good credit assignment, you must be sure that these memories aren't interfered. You mustn't think of anything else. So the function of pleasure is to turn off almost all your mental processes, completely negative, so that the noise level in your head is very low, and this rather delicate data that's still in various caches and short-term memory don't get erased. Because if you start to think about anything else, so maybe the function of pleasure is, let's get in a state where all your goals are turned off so you don't try to solve any other problems, and nothing much is happening except for this perhaps very intense and unconscious process of replaying these things, because maybe you remember what was nice, and so that's a very sensible theory of pleasure, and I've never heard anything like it. Because most people think pleasure means feeling good, and that's primitive and elemental and, you know, like earth, air, fire, and water. And they don't have the idea that if something seems elemental, then that's your chance to make a really good theory.
It also works well with your theory of pain,
Yeah.
which is essentially the idea that there's a goal that keeps resurfacing,
Right. So you.
interrupting your other goals.
Right, and the other parts of your mind get really annoyed that they can't get anything done, and that's my theory of what suffering is. But if the pain stays there, then that's a serious bug, but it's worth it, because if you ignore damage to tissues, you'll probably get an infection or die or something, and you won't be able to solve those problems anyway. So it's very rational to be disrupted by pain. But I've never seen anybody recognize or even suggest that, except they complain that it's bad to get addicted to a drug, which just makes you feel good without learning anything. And that's right. You don't want to disrupt all the other activities unless there's an important one that you're allowing to proceed. Has anybody ever seen a discussion of why people like pleasure? I just don't remember any.
Why do people like watching war movies?
Boy, that's a great question. And why did you write it?
I'm sorry? Why do I like?
Why don't you write one? I think I haven't seen anything. There's the superficial one, which is it's getting aggression out of your system, and there's no reason to believe that.
I would enjoy watching like the first gore movies.
It's nice watching the bad people get killed. It appeals to your
It's
Protestant
just,
ethic.
For me, it's just entertainment. It's like neat things are happening. That's all. You know, things that you don't see.
Well, I think sometimes we like detective stories because we actually learn a new trick. But I always read the last chapter first, because these detective story writers are good, and they do think of a new trick, and you find out in the last chapter I don't see the point of the rest.
You're really worried about wasting your time.
What?
I said you're worried about wasting your time.
Yes,
Pleasure is less important than wasting your time.
right.
No,
And I don't think you're wasting your time watching a detective story if you just read the end, because you'll learn a new way to kill people, which might come in handy. I really don't know why they watch sports games, and I have to admit that if I turn one on and it's really exciting, it's hard to turn it off, because I guess you identify with this poor quarterback. And
would you be interested in, would people be interested in watching sports if there are no audience on the TV? So if you can only see the players play.
I keep annoying people with another alternative. You know, there are people who like to see Hamlet performed over and over again by different actors. So that's why would you ever want to see the same opera twice? Because most people don't want to see the same opera once, so it's a subpopulation.
Well,
But I was wondering if, suppose there was a really good baseball game, like, wasn't the last game of the Red Sox when they won that World Series last year or a couple of years ago? Now,
2 years ago.
whatever it was, it's considered quite a great game. So what they should do is they should get other teams to perform that game, just as you get other actors to perform Hamlet. And eventually there will be a really good performance of that game, even better than the actual one. And the critics will write these reviews of why this game was so much better than that, although all the plays are the same. And when you think about it, it would take much more skill to play the same game again than the first one, because you'd have to hit the ball into exactly the same place. So this hasn't happened in sports, has it? Where there's a classic game and people keep trying to make it slightly better by hiring really good actors. Robin Williams and Richard Dreyfuss as pitcher and catcher. And get all the really high-powered actors on that field. Joke. I think we need some good theories about why people like particular kinds of entertainments. It's really probably very important.
it would be a good media lab paper, I suppose.
Right. Yes, I think if you take the most, there's a reference in the Emotion Machine to a New Zealand study of how people spend their time. And it's still on the web. Some government bureau in New Zealand funded some researchers to find out how much time people spent on various things. And what we should do is take the 10, what are the 10 things you spend most time on? And obviously eating and sleeping and watching TV and driving. And
Some of this work has been done in the United States by some people who are called ecological psychologists.
okay,
The outstanding names are Barker and Wright. They wrote a book called One Boy's Day, where they followed a little boy around, a team of 6 flying data transcribers, followed the kid around and wrote down everything he did in exquisite detail. And this was situated in a Midwestern town, which I believe was Muncie, Indiana. So it was basically all very wholesome stuff.
okay, so then the next thing is, let's find out what are the 10 best activities and then award a prize to the best theory of why people spend so much time on that activity.
Well, it might be instructive as a place to begin, to actually look
Yes.
at this work of Barker and Wright.
Yeah, so we
And
need,
it was, for me, an inspiration.
Oh, do they have a
to
chapter on
make these
each?
studies.
do they have a theory of each of the activities?
Oh, no, they just have huge lists of the most bizarrely inappropriate and strangely connected things happening right after each other.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because I went to Europe for a week last year, and I had the impression that people eat almost all the time. But, so I wondered why they spent so much time eating.
Yeah, I guess the main impression you come away from Barker and Wright is that the high level of near chaos in everyday life that we just don't pay much attention to. And the transience of patterns of thoughts and little behaviors that people perform. And so I highly recommend the work.
Yeah, I'm a little worried about the standard school year because you spend 45 minutes on something. I just went to a school day last week at a grandchild's school, and it was Grandparents' Day. So grandparents came to the school, and we sat in on each of the classes, some of which were very good.
Oh, that's good.
But my main impression was that they think about arithmetic for 45 minutes or an hour or something, and then there was an interesting class where they try to figure out why there's some clause in the Constitution. That was very interesting. And then there was a Latin class which was astounding, because the teacher had suddenly gotten the idea that you give a child a Latin sentence and they have to go up to the board and draw a cartoon describing the action that this sentence is about. And it was sort of brilliant because the kids had a big struggle figuring out what the words meant and a big struggle figuring out how to draw, and almost all of them drew something pretty interesting. But my impression was, how can you ever think about anything if every hour you have to change what you're doing? And some of you are MIT students, and you know that the way you solve a problem is you stay up all night, unless it's one of those awful problem sheets where you do 20 problems, each of which take 20 minutes, which also takes staying up all night, but it's hard to learn much. But there's no way these kids get to spend a whole day at anything for 12 years.
It's really bad.
Strange.
And I also think that it would be much instructive to teach one big problem and with small variations instead of 20 very different problems.
Yes, there was a Professor King here at MIT. I think he was in chemistry, but he retired. But he attempted something called intensive study, and he managed to pull it off for a while, but it was something like you do a course in 6 weeks, and you take one course at a time instead of 4.
I'm taking one course.
What?
I'm saying I'm taking one course in this semester. I don't do anything else. I just have this in my mind. That's it.
Not this one.
Well, this is the only thing that I remember.
I see.
Yeah.
Yes, and surely people should do, I mean, there might be subpopulations of people who are good at learning 6 different things in 6 hours in a day, and there must be people who are good at thinking about 2 things for 3 hours, and there are probably some people who are good at thinking about 1 thing for 2 days, and there's no room for that.
Well, that was when my kids were growing up, when I was a graduate student here. My son and daughter I took them out of school.
You did homeschooling
So
for
they
a
were
while.
homeschooled. And this meant they had the opportunity, when they wanted to take advantage of it, to concentrate on things. And this was especially important to my son, who got hooked on the Second World War and developed a fascination with history. Would go to the local library and get all the books that he could. This was the Heath School, a lovely little school that was in the library over in the far corner of Brookline.
Oh,
And he read all the books they had on the Second World War there, then came over here and found that there was a Naval ROTC library in Building 20, I think it was at that time. And we got into looking into James' books to find out about the defenses and so forth. So, I mean, it's really surprising that somebody 8 or 9 years old could get that caught up and that engaged in
Now-
looking into stuff. And he did. I
What are-
suspect that all other children would too.
What are the legal problems of homeschooling? Did you have to fill out some certificates?
I got help from John Holt, and getting my kids out of school. At that time, if I had taken them out of school without permission, I would have been legally liable and subject to imprisonment. This was back in the 1970s. But since, in fact, we knew the chairman of the local board of education who ran the local bookstore, and since another person on the board of education was our child's pediatrician, we were able to put together a nice proposal that said, oh, it would be great, they'd learn all this stuff at home, and then they'd go up to MIT and hang around the lab there, and at the end of the year, they'd take the standard exams that everybody else took. And that was good. This was a liberal community which was willing to do that, even in a state with some blue laws at that time in Connecticut.
And 2 of them got admitted to MIT, didn't they?
Yeah,
Which must have cost a bundle.
it certainly did.
So it can be done. But is it harder now, or is all you have to do is know John Holt and some people on the Board
Well, no,
of
I think it's a
Education?
lot easier now.
Uh-huh.
At least that's my general impression. John Holt, of course, is died. I think homeschooling movements are a lot more popular than they used to be, and with good reason.
But
But
you
I
have,
don't think it hurt the kids at all.
well, you have to have somebody at home to do it, which is
Yeah.
a big job.
But it's funny how character shows through too. I mean, my daughter Miriam was 2 years younger than my son, and one of her favorite activities was to go over to the coop, into the children's section, and read all the books without buying them, feeling she was sort of pulling one over all the institutions of our society. She's much more conservative.
Did any of you go to a non-standard school? Yeah,
I was homeschooled throughout my high school,
wow.
so I didn't go to school then.
How did your parents pull this off?
Well, I was in Zambia, right? So it's in Africa, and they didn't really care about that.
Oh, so they wouldn't have been in jail if,
No, they wouldn't. I don't know.
Well, didn't
I
your
remember
friend
getting
Danny
sick
Hillis-
was if you got sick and didn't have to go to school, that was a great event because you could stay in bed and think for a whole day or two. Sorry.
Didn't Danny Hillis, wasn't he schooled at home as well for a period of time?
I don't, well, Danny Hillis' father he was an entomologist, and he never spent much time in any one place when he would go from country to country. So I'm not sure what his education was like, but they were always jumping around to study some new epidemic or plague or something. So that's another way to have a non-standard education. And he homeschools his kids right now.
Are there any studies of differences between homeschooled and public school?
Are there any studies about this?
Of differences, like I imagine, children interacting with 29 other children of the exact same age would have some kind of social effect on the child versus not having that.
Well, generally, you might think of it this way. If a kid is schooled at home, probably in the main, he's interacting with people more grown up than
Yeah.
he is on the average. So he might be expected to be a little bit more mature and to possibly converse at a more advanced level, as opposed to spending all his time with people who know as little as he does. But of course, you always have one teacher there who tell everybody the truth and provide a good example.
But there's a question of getting, if you are too much of an adult as a child, I imagine it might be harder to get along with other children or something like that.
Well, I have a theory about that, which is that you want the least possible contact with people of your same age, because you'll remain infantile. Because if you have I have that paragraph in some article. You start with 6-year-olds in a room full of 6-year-olds, and then there is a teacher to add a little maturity, but then the same children are still learning from each other, and when they grow up, they all have the social skills of 6-year-olds. And there is a study of IQs, but I don't know if it's valid, that says that children who have a sibling who's 5 years older have higher IQs by a significant amount than ones who have siblings 1 year older or younger. Yeah.
I wonder if in human history that whether this idea of spending so much time, of kids spending so much time with other kids is relatively new, right?
I think it's only about 100 years old, in
Yeah.
fact.
And I was just reading today about how, I think it was around in the 1920s or so that this whole, well, no, not in the 1920s, sorry, but as this society transformed from an agricultural society, how this whole idea of teenagers being a different generation with their own slang, their own language,
Yes.
and a generation gap started to emerge. But maybe spending a lot of time with kids your own age is new for humans.
Yeah, I think
I don't know how good that is actually. I don't know whether humans have evolved whether we've evolved institutions that use that time well enough.
well, before cars and cities, I think right now 80% of the population are in cities, and it used to be much less, like 20%. And if you're not in a city and you don't have private transportation, then there's no way you could get 20 7-year-olds in a class, because there wouldn't be that many in a small town, or in a farming area. They'd have to go several miles, so you couldn't have graded classes. So it must have been very rare, except in very big cities. Anybody know the history of schools?
Well, I don't know it well, but my impression from conversations with Shep White, who was a developmental psychologist at Harvard, my impression was that around the beginning of the previous century, the 20th century, there is a broad movement in American society to advance the acculturation of a large number of new European immigrants to the United States through the establishment of public schooling for a number of children, more so than was previously the practice in the past.
Huh.
And that in addition, there are other organizations like the Boy Scouts, which were formed to teach American values to young people who might not otherwise be so exposed to them. And so I think there's this sort of acculturation to America and American ideals that played a large part in the move to public schooling at the beginning of the last century.
But you couldn't have a graded public school except in a pretty urban place.
Yeah.
So they were sort of one-room schoolhouses in rural areas with people of every age, or larger groups of ages.
a little funny story that might emphasize the difference of having different age people in your class. Where I went to school, we had, you might say, the normal students, say in 5th grade, all of us about the same age and so forth, with our petty squabbles and fights with each other. And we also had a large number of young men who were recent immigrants from Southern Europe, say typically Italian. And they'd be in our classes as well. And you know, we were just so immature and so childish, and our concerns were so petty that they suppressed any sort of trivial conflict between the younger children and told us all to grow up and act grown up and not be so silly. So what I'm saying is these immigrants had a very civilizing effect on the urban school that I went to. I don't know if you see that nowadays.
That's interesting. A few civilized older people could make a big difference, even if you couldn't understand what they said.
What do you think will happen in 50 years? Like, do you think that with technology, that maybe education will be so individualized that we won't
Oh, yeah,
need the physical
certainly.
building?
If the children have time and if they can escape playing games and things like that, then they have access to all sorts of great things. So I think I know quite a lot of young children who look things up on the web when they want an answer to a question instead of waiting to find someone who knows it. So that's
Well, every time you pass an exam, you could get a new game to play. Then, so
yes. Right now the exam is the game itself, and if you kill enough
yeah.
aliens, then you get to the next level. So it's a powerful educational system, but it's not clear that the skills are very useful. But another question is, will there ever be a good theory of learning that's good enough to get in the schools so that at some point you can teach children how to learn? Because,
Learn how to think.
well, both, yeah. That is, right now we teach them particular skills and knowledge about particular subjects, but we don't have any systematic way to teach ways to think. It's not part of the curriculum. Papert used to point out a lot. And there's no remedy for this right now because there aren't good theories of what are good ways to think and how can you acquire them. So it's hard to see any fundamental reform in education. But I think Nancy's point is certainly there's an alternative to education with the web, and the power of that's going to, presumably is going to just keep growing to the point where someday Google or something else will get good enough that it'll actually understand a question you ask, and people can start to
Question, if I will. Back to this issue of there not being a good enough theory of learning. Do you think the problem is essentially or primarily psychological or epistemological?
well, I think what's happened is that the things that people propose as theories of learning are ancient reinforcement behaviorist stuff like that you have to have the reward at the right time, and I don't know of any, so would you call that, what was your distinction?
Well, whether the question is psychological, do we lack a learning theory because we don't understand human individual psychology well enough?
Mm-hmm.
Or do we lack an adequate learning theory because we don't understand well enough the nature of knowledge, the nature of problem solving, and how to communicate those things
Yeah,
to a human being.
I think it's both, but there's a big emphasis when you say, quote, psychological, there's a lot of emphasis on superficial emotion theory, which is ideas like the classroom should be pleasant and positive and that sort of thing. And those come from the low-grade behaviorist reinforcement experiments on animals. And the idea that children should learn to enjoy the discomfort of being wrong and fixing it, just like they enjoy the discomfort of playing football and getting hurt all the time. And there doesn't seem to be any problem in getting millions of kids to enjoy discomfort, but that's not considered a positive. A goal of education is to relish the discomfort of, what did I call it, of exploration, and the fun of making mistakes and finding corrections. And we just don't have it's not part of the epistemological theory of learning that learning to enjoy mistakes and find bugs and fixing them is very important.
Well, it seems to me one of the nicest things in your emotion machine is you're bringing to the fore the idea of a structure which rises to the point where self-ideals become an important part of what a mind is.
Mm-hmm.
Because these are the things that I believe help people to generate a lifelong of learning by putting out in front of themselves a vision of the self they would like to be.
Uh-huh.
And we need to get beyond that lovely quatrain of Longfellow, who said, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and through dying, leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. But, I mean, to go beyond that to something to say, or to look at somebody's work and say, wow, that was really a stunning piece of work. I would like to be the kind of person who could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, that happened to me when I was an undergraduate at Caltech taking a psych course. And I ran across a book by Robert White, who was in the social relations department up at Harvard. It was called Lives in Progress. I said, wow, what great work that is. Wouldn't it be neat to be able to do that sort of thing? And somehow I think whatever theory of learning we have has to better articulate how people, if you're going to teach somebody something, you want to teach them to hope and have a vision that can lead them into their own authentic activity.
Yes, and I guess the trouble is, if there were a well-supported, highly developed theory of how people do learn to be good at solving new kinds of problems, then I don't see any reason why it wouldn't drift into the curriculum. And besides teaching history and arithmetic and those other things, there would be a course in thinking and problem solving and so forth. But I don't see any way to recommend it now because there's no community of psychologists or people in authority who would agree with any such theory. The theory that, the standard theory is you should give people problems that are just slightly harder than the last one, and so that they're almost always successful and that rewards are much more reinforcing than disappointments. And that sort of, have any of you, what's in an education school these days? Do they discuss these things? You were in one,
No,
weren't you?
I mean, the sort of things that appeal to me are statements like, used to be the motto of a bank in Camden, New Jersey, was that if there's a problem, they're saying, we'll find a way or make one. Or this great slogan of Henry Kaiser, who said if you face an insoluble problem, he said that's just an opportunity and a workload. I mean, that's sort of very positive approach to the really difficult problems of our time or any other, to say, wow, that's really an opportunity if you can think about it.
Didn't I have a quote by Paul Anderson in The Emotion Machine, which no matter how hard a problem is, there's some way you could make it harder.
Actually, I wonder whether it's more important to teach people how to think or how to really select goals, and some of the bugs that evolution has given people, like getting too much angry or worrying for no reason, or
Yes.
getting depressed and things like that. That's just a very wide variety of things that I just said, but there might be a lot of other things that people.
Yes, there's a,
So many bugs in our.
what's the name for
Daily-
anger control?
I'm sorry,
There's a catchphrase for anger control.
anger management?
Anger management. Yes, so we need thinking management. And of course, there are these wonderful specialists like Edward de Bono and about, that's a joke I made today, thinking out of the box. And of course, we need a book on thinking in the box, because most people can't solve.
They can't get out of the box.
Right, they can't solve not very hard problems. And of course, there's, in previous civilizations, I think it wasn't believed that mass education could do this sort of thing. And you would decide that certain people would be in the first stream and go to Oxford, and other people would go to skills school. What's it called? What? Yeah, right, all those things. So the idea that everybody would be educated to be brilliant, original thinkers is not has not been a popular idea over the centuries. And maybe it's a terrible idea. What if everybody were really creative? It would be, every time you turn around, things would be different. And
Maybe the problem is more that it's too kind of declarative instead of procedural.
yes,
And that people are learning kind of the state of science as is, and they're not really learning all of the mistakes that people made to lead to this current state.
yes, I have a mathematical anecdote, because you all know how to do Riemann integrals, where to find the area under a curve, you draw these columns, and you take the midpoint of the height of each thing and add them up, and that's the Riemann integral is finding the area by adding up those slices. And you can prove that as the slices get smaller, if the function is continuous, then that converges, and then the rest of calculus is learning formulas for the limit that you get for integrating each of the elementary functions and that sort of thing. And then if you took another math course, then you would learn Lebesgue integration. There's a thing called measure theory, and there, to get the area under a curve, you take slices this way. And you see how many little rectangles you can put that way, and you add those up, and lo and behold, you get the same result, except that it also works for non-continuous functions and does all sorts of things better in some cases. And then when I was a young mathematician, I ran across some book, and I forget whether it was The Theory of the Integral or a book on something else. But in this book, the guy is solving all sorts of problems. Whenever you get a new problem, he invents another integral which is just right for that problem, and it breaks the thing up in some other ways and adds them up, and you prove a little thing. When you invent one of these, you have to prove that it converges, and the proofs are all pretty much the same. So then I got the hang that if you're trying to solve a problem, you just invent the right integral for that, and it's easy. And so that's a sort of meta-procedural thing, and we don't teach that. So even, as you said, it's most of what we teach is declarative, and some of it's procedural. And then I suppose the next level is how do you make a new procedure? And in some parts of mathematics, a lot's known about that. And there are different categories of things, and you learn how to make them. But I don't see that in, I don't know if there's anything like that outside of mathematics.
But is it a big jump if you have a large library of procedures already and you know how to solve a lot of problems? Is it a big jump to be able to get better at creating new procedures?
Well, I don't see, in some cases there may be a stone wall that people spend 300 years and finally somebody jumps over it.
Sure.
But in lots of cases, if you know a lot of procedures and they don't seem to work, maybe there's a small change to get a new one. So,
Well, this is in context to, again, problem solving. I don't know, I feel people give too much, I don't think hard problems are a really good way to teach.
well, hard.
Unless you diagnose like what the person already knows or not. Because you might just be, or maybe, you solve a hard problem and then you get a lot of related problems after you have solved the hard problem yourself.
Sometimes even if you don't solve the hard problem, you come away better at something. Somehow I once, you know that if two sides of a triangle are equal, then the base angles are equal. It's an isosceles triangle. Didn't I mention this early in the term?
Yeah, I think you
Yeah. You know that the angle bisectors are equal also. However, if in a triangle two angle bisectors are equal, how do you prove the sides are equal? And I remember, I told you, I spent a couple of days on that and I never did get a proof. But I learned a lot of geometry just from all the things that went wrong. And then the end of the story is I asked, there was a Chinese student, and I asked him, and he said, oh, you do it this way. And I said, how did you figure that out? And he said, I didn't. I learned that in high school in China. But,
Yes,
somebody figured it out.
My point is that a lot of regular people would not be able to solve very hard problems, and the reason would be that they just have not solved a lot of those mini procedures that eventually lead up to the solution of the hard problem. So,
Yeah, well, people are,
well, it's a matter of kind of illustrating that hard problems are not that hard. There are ways to get there. And
yeah,
you
there are all
can
kinds of,
still-
some problems are very hard for some people and they just don't, like if you do something and it didn't work, what do you learn from it? So the hardness of a problem might depend on how good is your credit assignment. What will you blame your failure on? And if you pinpoint the right blame, then you'll try another approach that gets around that.
I wonder if any textbook, a lot of textbooks have solved examples, but I wonder if they show that maybe this method, try this method, but it doesn't work. Oops.
Yeah.
Waste of paper.
Well, look, in mathematics, whenever you have a theorem in a good book, then you give some counterexamples of showing why it won't work if you weaken any of the assumptions. So in mathematics, counterexamples are really very important, and you're always, in fact, if you publish a theorem and one of the assumptions can be weakened, then people say, oh, look, you missed the whole point. But
Well, that's a central idea to Patrick Winston's near-miss learning, is that if a well-chosen counterexample can allow you to kind of pigeonhole the salient difference
yeah,
that's important for distinguishing between
yeah.
what you're trying to learn.
So, yeah, what makes a problem hard is just how a math problem could be hard if the shortest proof is extremely long and the chances of finding it by any procedure are small. So I suppose in some sense some problems can be basically hard, but most cases if you know enough, some problems are hard just because the student at that level can't be expected to have figured out some shortcut. I don't know.
So hard problems are just long problems?
It's a suitcase.
Well, it seems like there's some benefit to working on problems that are way over your head too. There are certain skills that are involved in working on problems that are way beyond your ability.
There's something like that. I used to go to lectures that I couldn't understand any of in math colloquiums, and then a couple of years later, I say, oh, that's what he must have meant, and something becomes clear. I'm not sure how much of that stuff is, how valuable is trying problems at the next grade level fairly often. And students are protected from that in well-engineered textbooks. There are no surprises. So should you give people problems they can't possibly solve every now and then without telling them? There's a famous, but I don't remember it clearly, where somebody put an unsolved problem on a Putnam exam and it got solved.
Thinking that it's insoluble can help a lot.
What's that? Knowing
I
that
think if you don't know a problem is like insoluble, then that can give you a leg up over people who think that it's.
That's right. I once spent a long time. I worked with a great mathematician named Hao Wang on various problems about Turing machines and things for a couple of years. And there was one big unsolved problem. I can tell you what it is. There's the predicate calculus, which is logical expressions where you say for all x, there exists a y such that for all z, such and such. And it turns out that, so that expression is AEA, for all, for some, for all. And then there are other expressions which say there exists a x such that for all y there exists a z and such and such. That's another class of expressions. And then there are lots more, like you could have 10 quantifiers with 2 a's and 5 e's and 3 a's and so forth. And there was a conjecture that any expression in predicate calculus is equivalent, if you add enough variables, to a single expression that just has for all x, there exists a y such that for all z. But then you can have all sorts of things inside that parenthesis. It turns out that all higher level expressions can be pushed into that form by combining variables in various ways. So Hao Wang finally proved that, and I spent a couple of months trying to prove it, or maybe longer, And so I'd try to find a proof, and then I'd find a bug, and I'd say, well, maybe it isn't true. And then I'd try to construct a counterexample, and I'd make a lot of progress on that, and then I couldn't get the counterexample to work, so I said, well, maybe the theorem's true. And, How Wang was convinced that it was true all along and beat me to the prize. And so he sort of knew it was true, although he didn't. But he was sure it was true, and I wasn't sure which way it would go. So maybe I was just taking twice as long, or possibly I would never have got it. Of course, there's no way to tell now. But so I'm sure what Wang had done was he assumed it was true as though he knew it. He said, it has a solution, so he didn't waste time trying to disprove it. That's what he had told me.
Maybe there was a third person who spent his entire time looking for counterexamples because he was sure it was false.
Well, and then he might be able to, I think looking for the counterexample has a fair chance of being productive, because at some point you see, oh, I see, this means there can't be a counterexample. Because to make the counterexample, you'll show these two conditions have to be satisfied, and you stick 0 and 1 in both of them, and there's no way to do it. So searching for a counterexample can, if you can prove that there isn't one, then if your system is, doesn't that show that doesn't that give you a proof?
Yeah,
I think, yeah, if you've proved there's no counterexample, that must be a proof. Unless I'm missing some locally inconsistent.
The excluded middle.
Yeah, right.
So the psychologist Vygotsky has this zone theory that there's a zone where for optimal learning, or for learning, and that if problems are easier than that, they're boring, and if they're harder than that, they're frustrating. And then there's this sweet spot right in the middle where the problem's just hard enough to teach you something, but not so hard that you give up in frustration.
But does that leave room for a problem sheet where there's 26 almost the same ones?
Well, the second thing is also
Because the third one should automatically become boring if they weren't too hard.
Right. Well, there's this other thing that I think you need, which is to automatize some of the procedures so that the first few times you rehearse them with your executive functioning. But if you have to keep using your executive skills in order to solve a problem, you can't easily use that as a procedure for solving harder problems. Like we saw that with our kids, that you reach a stage where you can figure out what 6 times 7 is every single time correctly, using several different tricks. But if you still don't know it instantly, then you can't use that fact in order to play with the numbers and discover the next thing.
Yeah.
Isn't it good to go to sleep after you have learned a new procedure for a few days, and maybe you'll remember it after that?
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
There is some reason to believe that.
That might be how we could improve schools dramatically without getting better teachers or curricula. Or move them to 11 a.m.
Oh yeah, that is very important, I think.
Yeah.
No, aren't they able to take it seriously?
I know
it's
so important.
At first I went to research, I thought a four-day school week sounded about right, because it just feels, that's what feels about right. You just really get kind of exhausted with it, and you want 3 days to do something else. Don't ramp up in a weekend. So I went to see how many 4-day schools there were in the United States. There's very few. They're only in the mountains, and they're just a couple of systems. And then I went to can there be late schools? And there are a few, like 9 a.m., which kind of completely misses the point.
Why should do 7 a.m.?
Well, they do 7. These middle schools and high schools are 7 a.m. now in most places.
My college used to start at 8, and first year we have like 5 hours of classes right through that.
What's the argument? How many hours school should be, or when it should start?
Well, it's about how do you get enough rest. So probably the most important thing is to actually get sleep every day. And if you have to get up at the wrong hour, then you can't get it.
The second thing
But
is...
then how many days it is a different rhythm.
Can I say something? Or after you're done?
We're all done.
Sorry.
We're done.
I think that, I know that there are like some internet schools, my understanding is that there are actually high schools where kids study and learn online, just as adults will take university classes. And I think that, and also nowadays, even in education, sometimes teachers will keep web folios. But I think that when you have, one teacher and 25 kids, I think that it's really so challenging getting each child's learning style needs met that, well, maybe it'll be possible to develop computer programs that will be able to kind of detect
Sure.
what a person's learning style is, and that will be able to kind of revise itself for that child to offer the lesson according to that child's learning style.
Absolutely.
And I'm not certain that the school buildings need to continue to exist. Like, I'm not sure that in 50 years, once people have greater access to figuring out what they individually need to learn, I'm not sure that having the physical building of the school is what's going to be the best way to tap into individual talent.
No, absolutely. That suggests another idea. If you could tell which kids are good at what kind of representations and so forth, then you could use video systems, because maybe one teacher could in fact handle 20 children who have the same learning style, even if they're in different cities. Because right now, if you take a random class of 20 kids, it might be that 7 of them are almost primarily visual, and you have to draw pictures and so forth, and 5 of them are almost exclusively verbal and can't understand diagrams and so forth. So there might be a few major categories of children, each of whom are wasting at least half of their time in class because the teacher is presenting it in a way that's good for this other group.
And maybe have
If you had a theory of that, you could collect them into remote classes where the teacher is dealing with 20 people who are almost the same.
I think they're most important for the first few years. That's most important for the first few years, because after that, mostly becomes like reading and thinking and mathematics.
Yes, we're also in this crazy situation where she has one child who's one day too old to be in a certain class, so it's going to waste a year.
Well, I used to be like that, and apparently my parents legally changed my birthday.
Oh,
So,
Was that in the United States?
no.
well, why can't you
Let's
do
leave
it?
at that.
Why can't you do it here?
There's a way.
What?
I wonder if there's a way.
Try 2 different.
I'll ask Alan Dershowitz next time I see him. He can cure anything.
Cool.
But isn't it interesting that we
There's a
don't
great lawyer in Brookline who didn't he get O.J. Simpson off the hook or something?
Oh, Alan Dershowitz.
Yes. Maybe he can change this kid's birthday a little bit.
But when you think about like Bob's kids, I mean, imagine if each child really had the opportunity to develop their talents and their interests, how many more problems we'd have solved in this society.
They
Well,
might
Roger
all.
Shank is working on that very idea about like electronic, like video games that kids can learn within the context of problem solving. So they learn a little bit of math, a little bit of computer science, a little bit of physics as they go along, like playing some game. But
Now you kill one monster, now you get to kill 2.
I think that's helpful as an adjunct, but I also think that for many kids, well, for some kids, that teachers provide a role model and play an inspirational role that can't be replaced by electronic or purely textual materials. That they will go into the classroom and that even if the teacher is teaching at the wrong level for them, because they're a top 1% kid and the teacher is teaching to the 50th or 25th percent level, that seeing the teacher's love of knowledge and also emulating how the teacher approaches teaching and engages with knowledge, provides them with model.
I should say, I am a teacher, and I'm an adult, I'm a teacher of adults. And I love teaching, and I definitely agree, I hope that teachers have a wonderful value. I'm not sure that that role couldn't be taken by some other members of society. For example, a mentor. Let's say that a child was discovering a love of music, at a young age, maybe another musician, for example, could provide that same inspiration. I don't know, I think it's worth considering. And I see your point too. Yeah.
Or a good simulation of a teacher dressed as Spider-Man, if the child regards Spider-Man as the perfect role model. Well, those are good questions.
I was going to mention, in response to your comment about Vygotsky's theory of learning, that just last week, Bo and I met with Mike Merzenik, and he was talking about how there's this layer of plasticity, or there's a bunch of learning mechanisms in the cortex that are activated under certain conditions, such as surprises, or I guess you could think of it as failure-based reformulation. Or the other one is credit assessment, or when you accomplish your goal successfully. But he said, when you're surprising people in order to activate these mechanisms, there's the risk of surprising them in a negative way, in that they are threatened by the surprise, in which case they don't activate the learning mechanisms, which is pretty, it was really interesting because it kind of gets to this point that you have to teach people at the right sort of schedule, and you can't give them too much knowledge at once, or else they might become discouraged about what they're learning.
Yeah, they get a good theory of multi-level learning, so that when a child is learning phonemes, those are all auditory cortex kind of ideas, but when they're learning phonemes, there has to be a consistent kind of patterned input, so they can learn the first layer in terms of just basic information metrics, where there's not a lot of, the learning mechanism is always on. And then his theory is that as the child develops an inhibitory mechanism of attention, so you can then inhibit the attention module, which is always on when it's a very young infant, then the learning becomes selective. So in an adult, the attention has to be focused in order to continue to learn. And yeah, in the case of noisy inputs, this first layer isn't even learned at all. So yeah, this gets back to the idea of a consistent kind of imprimer.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he's saying. If you have a layer where you've learned to recognize phonemes and you start to build on it, it might be that you want to stop the lower layer from learning for a long time, because otherwise the stuff above becomes inconsistent.
Right, yeah, so the always-on learning is really only in the infant stage. And so then the learning stops after a point, only when there's kind of a reinforced, very basic theory of learning in terms of just
Yeah,
reinforcement.
so I don't see why the word attention is used there.
Well, there's, the learning stops and is only active in the context of reward later on. And so there's,
Well, so in a multi-layer thing, you could have learning every other layer for a while. I'm not sure.
there's a lot of little interesting theories in terms of compiling information down.
Yeah.
So in the first layer, there were specific frequencies represented, which then were combined into more complex combinations of frequencies in the second layer. And he noticed that after a certain amount of maturation, these complex frequencies would actually move down to the more primitive layer afterwards.
You mean the earlier networks start to recognize more complex things?
Right. And then this gets back to the idea where a baby will actually learn to recognize a multitude of different phonemes that are even outside of their own culture. But then after a certain while, that opportunity window is kind of closed, and they no longer learn these new basic frequency patterns. Because the theory is that because they're compiled down into the more primitive layer, those distinctions between specific frequencies no longer exist.
Oh, I had a different theory in the Society of Mind for that. It was that if if the child, if you didn't stop your ability to learn phonemes at a certain age, then the parents would learn to imitate the child in order to communicate better, and language wouldn't develop in those cultures, and they would have died out. So my theory was that it's at the time of puberty, approximately, the ability to learn phonemes should stop, or else the culture will support language for much longer. But anyway.
Well, there are different levels of theories. Like yours is about the teleology or the selection pressure. The other one is about the mechanism.
Yes. Right. If it stops, there has to be a gene or something to stop it, or else it could be a complicated internal process that learns that making changes there makes trouble and learns to not learn, rather than being genetically primed to learn. Is there a big difference in age at which people stop learning phonemes? My impression was that around age 12 or so, the ability to learn new phonemes becomes very poor.
Well, the few lucky people never, well, for most people, that's the age at which you stop being able to learn a second language without an accent, no matter how many
Yes.
decades after that you spend immersed in that
That's right.
language. And then a few people can learn arbitrary new languages with a native accent at any age.
Well, there are only about 200 phonemes in all languages, somebody told me. So if you happen to learn all of them, then you can learn all languages without an accent. And somebody might do that by accident.